If you close your eyes for a moment and picture America in 1960, what do you see? Maybe it's the sound of a screen door slamming on a warm summer evening, the hum of a box fan in the window, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting across a quiet neighborhood where children rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on. The 1960s began with a sense of stability, at least on the surface. The United States was prosperous. World War II was 15 years behind us. Suburbs were expanding. Highways stretched across the country. Television sets glowed in living rooms from Maine to California. It was an era where families gathered around the evening news and believed, for the most part, in the American promise. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was finishing his term. John F. Kennedy would soon step into the spotlight, young, charismatic, representing a new generation. There was optimism in the air. The space race had begun. The country was looking toward the moon. It felt like the future was unfolding right before everyone's eyes. But underneath that optimism, something deeper was shifting. America in the early 1960s still carried strict social norms. Most households operated under clear roles. The father worked outside the home. The mother managed the household. Children were expected to respect authority without question. Communities were tight-knit. Churches were central. Sunday dinners were sacred. Television reinforced this image of order and tradition. Shows like Leave It to Beaver and The Andy Griffith Show painted pictures of wholesome, predictable American life. The black and white glow of the TV gave people a shared narrative about who they were. Yet, outside the frame of the camera, the country was restless. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. African Americans across the South were challenging segregation laws. College students were beginning to question long-standing traditions. Women were quietly asking whether domestic life was the only path available to them. There was tension, not explosive yet, but building. Economically, America was strong. Manufacturing jobs were plentiful. The middle class was expanding. A man could graduate high school, get hired at a factory, and expect to retire decades later with stability. Wages supported single-income households. Mortgages were affordable. New cars gleamed in driveways. But the world beyond America's borders was complicated. The Cold War loomed large. The threat of nuclear war wasn't abstract. Schoolchildren practiced duck-and-cover drills under their desks. Families built backyard bomb shelters. The Cuban Missile Crisis would soon bring the world terrifyingly close to nuclear confrontation. For many Americans who lived through that era, the 1960s were a study in contrast. On one hand, it was a time of innocence, children playing unsupervised, doors left unlocked, neighbors knowing one another by name. Music drifted from transistor radios. Rock and roll was evolving. Elvis had already shaken the culture, and a group called the Beatles would soon send shockwaves across the Atlantic. On the other hand, it was a decade of upheaval. Assassinations would shatter the illusion of security. Protests would fill city streets. The Vietnam War would divide families. Traditional authority would be questioned like never before. But in 1960, none of that felt inevitable. It felt like America stood at a crossroads without realizing it. The architecture of the time reflected that balance between tradition and change. Ranch-style homes spread across suburbs. Shopping malls began replacing downtown districts. Drive-in theaters buzzed on summer nights. Gas cost less than 30 cents a gallon. Fashion still leaned conservative. Tailored suits, pressed dresses, hats and gloves. But youth culture was already bending the edges of that formality. And perhaps that's the best way to describe the beginning of the 1960s. It was a decade that started with certainty. It ended with transformation. For those who lived through it, who remember the crackle of vinyl records, the sound of Walter Cronkite's voice announcing breaking news, the first time they saw a man walk on the moon, the 1960s were not just history. They were a turning point. And as we move deeper into this story, we'll step inside the homes, workplaces, and everyday lives of ordinary Americans to see how that turning point felt in real time. Because history is not just events, it's lived experience. And the 1960s changed America, not all at once, but piece by piece. If you walked through a typical American neighborhood in 1962, you would hear lawnmowers humming on Saturday mornings and smell bacon drifting from kitchen windows. Life felt patterned, almost rhythmic. Fathers left early for work in pressed slacks and polished shoes. Mothers tied aprons around their waists, packed school lunches in metal lunchboxes, and waved children off to class. Most households were single-income families. The breadwinner worked long hours in manufacturing plants, offices, or small businesses. The whistle at a steel mill or factory often marked the rhythm of the town. Work was steady. Retirement plans were straightforward. Loyalty between employer and employees still felt mutual. Women, for the most part, managed the home, but change was brewing quietly. More women were enrolling in college. More were questioning whether homemaking was the only path. Yet in the early part of the decade, domestic life was still idealized. Cookbooks were bestsellers. New kitchen appliances promised efficiency and modernity. Electric mixers, colorful refrigerators, and shiny chrome toasters. Children experienced a freedom that feels rare today. They played outside until dark without constant supervision. They built tree houses, played stickball in the streets, and rode bicycles without helmets. Summer felt endless. School days began with the Pledge of Allegiance. Teachers were respected figures of authority. Boys wore collared shirts, girls wore dresses or skirts. Discipline was firm but structured. College attendance was rising, especially by the mid-1960s, as a growing generation prepared to question the very systems they were entering. Entertainment centered around shared experiences. Television was the hearth of the American home. Families gathered around black and white sets to watch Ed Sullivan introduce new musical acts. Westerns like Bonanza and family sitcoms shaped cultural norms. When something important happened, a presidential speech, a breaking news bulletin, the entire country watched together. Music was undergoing rapid transformation. Early in the decade, crooners and doo-wop groups filled the airwaves. But by 1964, the British invasion exploded onto American screens. The Beatles' appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show wasn't just entertainment, it was generational ignition. Teenagers screamed, parents frowned, a cultural shift had arrived. By the late 1960s, rock music became a language of rebellion and identity. Folk artists sang about social justice. Lyrics began carrying messages about war, equality, and freedom. Fashion reflected this change too. Early 1960s fashion was polished. Tailored suits, pillbox hats, gloves. Jacqueline Kennedy influenced elegance nationwide. But as the decade progressed, hemlines rose. Colors grew bolder. Tie-dye, fringe, and denim emerged as symbols of youth counterculture. Cars were status symbols. Big, powerful engines, chrome details, convertibles cruising down Main Street. Drive-in theaters and diners were social hubs where teenagers gathered. Food culture was simple but evolving. TV dinners were new and exciting. Tupperware parties became social events for suburban women. Backyard barbecues defined summer weekends. Religion still played a central role in many communities. Sunday church attendance was common. Faith provided moral structure, though even that would face questioning as the decade progressed. Perhaps what defined daily life most was community. Neighbors borrowed sugar without hesitation. People attended town parades, local fairs, and school football games. News traveled by word of mouth as much as by broadcast. But beneath that sense of order, younger Americans were feeling restless. College campuses became places of intellectual awakening. Discussions about civil rights, free speech, and personal freedom intensified. Traditional authority, parents, teachers, government, was increasingly questioned. The gap between generations widened visibly by the end of the decade. And yet, for many ordinary Americans, life was not constantly political. It was lived day to day, raising children, paying bills, planning vacations, celebrating holidays. It was a decade where daily life could feel wonderfully normal, even as history accelerated around it. If the early 1960s felt steady, history didn't want long to shake that steadiness. On November 22, 1963, many Americans remember exactly where they were. A Friday afternoon, the school intercom crackling, a television being rolled into a classroom, a neighbor running across the yard with tears in her eyes. President John F. Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. For a generation that had grown up believing in upward momentum and national optimism, that moment was shattering. The image of Jacqueline Kennedy in her pink suit, the quiet dignity of the funeral procession, the small figure of John saluting his father's casket. These became collective memories etched into the American consciousness. It was the first time television delivered tragedy into living rooms in real time. and it would not be the last. The civil rights movement was transforming the nation simultaneously. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. Millions watched as he spoke about equality, justice, and the promise of America. By 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law, outlined segregation in public places. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, protecting access to the ballot. For many Americans, especially in the South, these changes felt seismic. Some celebrated progress, others resisted fiercely. Communities were divided, but history had shifted. At the same time, the Cold War simmered constantly. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world terrifyingly close to nuclear war. For 13 days, Americans listened to radio broadcasts and watched tense news reports as President Kennedy confronted the Soviet Union. Families feared the unthinkable. School children practiced drills. Bomb shelters were stocked. The threat felt real. And yet, just 7 years later, America would achieve something extraordinary. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. More than 600 million people worldwide watched. For Americans who had lived through war, assassination, and social upheaval, it was a moment of unity, of possibility. That's one small step for man, echoed through homes and bars and living rooms. The space race had been won.
But while rockets soared upward, conflict deepened on Earth. The Vietnam War escalated throughout the decade. What began as limited involvement expanded into full-scale military engagement. Young men were drafted. Families gathered around kitchen tables to discuss lottery numbers. Mothers held their breath when the mail arrived. Television again changed everything. For the first time, war footage appeared nightly on the news. Graphic images, body counts, burning villages. It was no longer distant. It was visible. Protests grew louder. College campuses became centers of anti-war demonstrations. The phrase generation gap became common as parents and children argued about patriotism, duty, and morality. 1968 became one of the most turbulent years in modern American history. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Riots erupted in cities across the country. Just 2 months later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was shot after winning the California Democratic primary. Hope felt fragile. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago that summer descended into chaos as protesters clashed with police. Television once again broadcast the conflict nationwide. The sense of innocence that defined the early part of the decade was gone. Yet not all milestones were tragic. The women's movement gained momentum. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique sparked conversation about identity beyond domestic roles. More women entered the workforce. Legal barriers began to weaken. Music festivals like Woodstock in 1969 symbolized cultural transformation. Hundreds of thousands gathered for peace, music, and community. It was messy, idealistic, chaotic, and unforgettable. Technological advances continued as well. Color television became more common, household appliances improved, air travel expanded, highways connected cities in new ways. The 1960s did not move slowly. They accelerated, and for those living through it, each year felt like stepping onto shifting ground. By the end of the decade, America was not the same country it had been in 1960. Institutions had been questioned, authority had been challenged, voices once silenced had demanded to be heard. It was painful, it was transformative, and it reshaped the identity of a nation. History is often told through presidents and protests, but the 1960s were lived in kitchens, factories, classrooms, and on front porches. Take Robert Miller, a 19-year-old from Ohio in 1966. He had just finished high school and was working at the local auto plant with his father. The factory floor was loud, hot, and steady. Robert expected to stay there for life. His father had. His grandfather had worked in steel before him. Then the draft Marius arrived. Robert's mother kept it folded on the kitchen table for 2 days before he opened it. The war in Vietnam had been something on television. Suddenly, it was personal. Robert went overseas in 1967. He returned in 1968, quieter than before. The town he left was the same barber shop, the same church pews, but he was not. He struggled to explain what he had seen. Many veterans did. Across the country in Alabama, Sarah Johnson was 14 in 1963 when she watched news coverage of the Birmingham protests. She had grown up in segregation, separate schools, separate drinking fountains, separate entrances. When the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, her high school integrated the following fall. The first day felt tense. Students avoided eye contact. Teachers tried to maintain normalcy. Sarah would later say that what she remembered most wasn't the shouting, it was the silence, the cautious way classmates studied one another, unsure how to bridge years of separation. Change was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was awkward, sometimes it was uncomfortable, but it moved forward. In California, Linda Martinez was 22 in 1968 and working as a secretary in Los Angeles. She loved her job but noticed something quietly unfair. The men she worked with were promoted quickly. She was praised for efficiency but never considered for leadership. One afternoon, she attended a small meeting discussing women's rights. It wasn't revolutionary, just conversation. But that meeting planted something in her. By 1972, she would return to school at night to pursue a degree. The 1960s cracked open doors that had long been sealed. In a small town in Pennsylvania, Harold and Margaret Thompson raised 4 children during the decade. Harold worked in coal mining. Margaret managed the home. Every Friday night was family movie night. Popcorn popped on the stove, black and white television glowing. They weren't marching in protests. They weren't debating foreign policy. They were raising children and hoping for stability. But even in their quiet town, the decade's changes arrived. Their oldest daughter came home from college in 1969 wearing bell-bottom jeans and talking about environmentalism. Harold didn't understand it at first. Margaret listened more closely. Every household experienced the 1960s differently. Some families were torn apart by political disagreement. Others grew stronger through shared struggle. Some embraced change enthusiastically. Others resisted until resistance became impossible. And then there were the small, beautiful moments that defined everyday life. First transistor radios blasting Motown on summer evenings, drive-in movie dates under star-filled skies, watching astronauts walk on the moon from a living room couch, neighbors gathering to watch the Super Bowl for the first time, young couples buying their first homes in expanding suburbs. The 1960s were not just turbulence. They were personal growth, awakening, sometimes confusion, but always movement. For many Americans now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, those years were formative. They shaped identity, values, perspectives on government, family, and freedom. It was a decade that demanded adaptation, and adaptation for ordinary people is rarely easy. If the 1960s had followed a straight path, they might be remembered simply as a decade of change, but they didn't. They twisted, fractured, and challenged nearly every assumption Americans held about themselves. For many families, the conflict wasn't abstract, it was personal. Dinner tables became battlegrounds. A father who fought in World War II might sit across from a son protesting the Vietnam War. One believed in duty and loyalty to country. The other believed in questioning authority and preventing unnecessary bloodshed. Neither was evil. Both were shaped by different historical moments, and that tension cracked households quietly. College campuses transformed into centers of unrest. In 1968, students at Columbia University occupied buildings in protest of university ties to military research. Across the country, sit-ins and demonstrations became common. What had once been quiet academic institutions turned into arenas of ideological debate. The older generation often watched with confusion. How can they protest the country that gave them everything? Many asked. But younger Americans saw it differently. They believed that loving their country meant demanding it live up to its promises. The civil rights movement, too, was not a smooth progression. While landmark laws were passed, violence often followed progress. Riots erupted in cities like Detroit and Newark. Communities burned. National Guard troops were deployed. Fear grew alongside reform. In rural towns, some residents felt threatened by rapid cultural shifts. In urban centers, activists pushed for faster, more dramatic change. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 felt like a breaking point. Hope had been fragile already. That loss shook the nation deeply. Churches filled, streets filled, anger and grief intertwined. Just 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy was killed. For many Americans, it felt like leadership itself was under attack. If the 1960s had followed a straight path, they might be remembered simply as a decade of change. But they didn't. They twisted, fractured, and challenged nearly every assumption Americans held about themselves. For many families, the conflict wasn't abstract, it was personal. Dinner tables became battlegrounds. A father who fought in World War II might sit across from a son protesting the Vietnam War. One believed in duty and loyalty to country, the other believed in questioning authority and preventing unnecessary bloodshed. Neither was evil. Both were shaped by different historical moments, and that tension cracked households quietly. College campuses transformed into centers of unrest. In 1968, students at Columbia University occupied buildings in protest of university ties to military research. Across the country, sit-ins and demonstrations became common. What had once been quiet academic institutions turned into arenas of ideological debate. The older generation often watched with confusion. How can they protest the country that gave them everything? Many asked. But younger Americans saw it differently. They believed that loving their country meant demanding it live up to its promises. The civil rights movement, too, was not a smooth progression. While landmark laws were passed, violence often followed progress. Riots erupted in cities like Detroit and Newark. Communities burned. National Guard troops were deployed. Fear grew alongside reform. In rural towns, some residents felt threatened by rapid cultural shifts. In urban centers, activists pushed for faster, more dramatic change. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 felt like a breaking point. Hope had been fragile already. That loss shook the nation deeply. Churches filled, streets filled, anger and grief intertwined. Just 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy was killed. For many Americans, it felt like leadership itself was under attack. By the time the calendar turned to 1970, America was not the same country it had been 10 years earlier, but neither were the people. The 1960s did not resolve neatly. There was no single moment when conflict disappeared or unity was restored. Instead, the decade ended the way it had unfolded, gradually, unevenly, with both exhaustion and hard-earned clarity. For many Americans, the resolution came internally before it came nationally. Families that had argued through the late 1960s began to rediscover balance. Parents who had once clashed with their college-age children slowly adjusted to the new reality. Long hair became less shocking. Protest signs faded into career paths. Many former student activists entered law, education, and politics, carrying their ideals with them. The Vietnam War would continue into the early 1970s, but by the end of the decade, public opinion had shifted decisively. Americans became more cautious about foreign military involvement. Trust in government, once nearly unquestioned in 1960, had changed permanently. And that shift, painful as it was, created a more questioning, more informed citizenry. The civil rights movement did not eliminate inequality overnight, but it permanently changed the legal and moral landscape of the nation. Schools integrated, voting access expanded, conversations about race moved from whispers to national platforms. Women, too, stepped into new roles. By 1970, more women were entering universities and professional fields. The quiet conversations of the early 1960s had grown into structured advocacy. The idea that women could shape their own economic futures became less controversial and more normalized. And yet, amid the societal changes, many Americans remember something else about the 1960s: community. Despite protests, despite war, despite disagreement, neighborhoods remained connected. People still borrowed tools from neighbors. They still attended weddings and funerals together. They still gathered around televisions to watch history unfold. The decade tested the country's unity, but it also revealed its endurance. For those who lived through it, the 1960s became a reference point. When later decades brought their own challenges, economic recessions, new wars, technological upheaval, many would say, we've been through worse. The 1960s taught Americans that institutions could be questioned without destroying the nation, that progress could be uncomfortable, that change often comes wrapped in conflict. It also taught humility. Leaders were not infallible. Systems required accountability. Voices once ignored could no longer be dismissed. There was growth in that realization. For a generation now in their 60s, 70s, and beyond, those years shaped lifelong values. Skepticism balanced with patriotism, resilience balanced with compassion, and perhaps most importantly, the understanding that history is not distant, it is lived. The 1960s forced Americans to examine who they were and who they wanted to be, and that examination, though painful at times, strengthened the country's democratic foundation, because growth rarely comes from comfort alone, it comes from challenge.
It's impossible to understand modern America without understanding the 1960s. The decade didn't just pass, it reshaped the country's foundation. Look around today, and you'll see its fingerprints everywhere. The civil rights legislation of the 1960s created legal protections that still define American society. The Voting Rights Act, though debated and modified over the years, fundamentally changed who had a voice in the democratic process. Integrated schools, equal access laws, and workplace protections all trace back to battles fought during that era. The women's movement of the late 1960s laid groundwork for career opportunities that millions of women benefit from today. Access to higher education expanded, professional roles broadened. Conversations that began in living rooms and small meetings grew into national policy changes. Even the skepticism toward government that many Americans feel today has roots in the 1960s. The Vietnam War and political assassinations taught citizens to question authority. Investigative journalism gained strength. Transparency became an expectation rather than a luxury. The media landscape changed forever. Before the 1960s, news was controlled and formal. After the 1960s, the public demanded more direct access, more immediacy, more accountability. The nightly news became essential viewing. The idea that citizens should witness history as it happened became normalized. The space race, culminating in the moon landing, ignited innovation that continues today. Satellite technology, telecommunications, and computing advancements can all trace elements of their acceleration to that era's push for exploration.
Culturally, the 1960s permanently altered American identity. Music became a form of expression beyond entertainment. Artists used lyrics to comment on society. That tradition continues across genres today. Whether it's country, hip-hop, rock, or folk, the idea that music can carry social commentary became mainstream during that decade. Fashion and personal expression also shifted permanently. The rigid dress codes of early 1960s America gave way to individual style. Self-expression became part of identity. Even generational dialogue, the tension between young and old, changed after the 1960s. The concept of a generation gap became part of the American vocabulary. Today's generational differences echo patterns first seen during that transformative decade. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the 1960s is this: Americans learned that change is inevitable, and that resisting change blindly can fracture society, while engaging with it thoughtfully can strengthen it. The people who were young in the 1960s are now elders in today's America. They carry with them lived memory of social upheaval, political turbulence, and cultural transformation. They know what it feels like to live through history. That perspective matters, because it brings patience. It brings long-term thinking. It brings an understanding that no era is entirely stable, and that resilience matters more than certainty. When modern America faces division, many who lived through the 1960s remember how divided the country once felt before, and how it endured. The decade taught a powerful lesson. America bends, it struggles, it argues, but it continues. And in that continuation, it adapts. The 1960s were not perfect. They were not peaceful. They were not unified, but they were formative. And their legacy lives not only in law books and history texts, but in the lived values of millions who experienced them firsthand. For viewers aged 60 and above, the 1960s are not distant history, they are memory.
memory of walking to school with friends, memory of watching the moon landing in awe, memory of arguments that shaped perspective, memory of hope that felt fragile and survived anyway. America today stands on foundations laid long before 1960, but reinforced by the challenges of that decade. The 1960s taught the country to question, to adapt, to expand its definition of equality and opportunity. And for those who lived through it, there is something uniquely powerful in knowing you were there, you witnessed it, you endured it, and in many ways you helped shape the America that exists today. History books may summarize the 1960s in a few chapters, but for those who lived it, it was a lifetime of moments, ordinary and extraordinary, woven together. And perhaps that's the final truth of the decade. It wasn't just about change, it was about growth. And growth, even when uncomfortable, leaves a legacy worth remembering. For viewers aged 60 and above, the 1960s are not distant history, they are memory. Memory of walking to school with friends, memory of watching the moon landing in awe, memory of arguments that shaped perspective, memory of hope that felt fragile and survived anyway. America today stands on foundations laid long before 1960, but reinforced by the challenges of that decade. The 1960s taught the country to question, to adapt, to expand its definition of equality and opportunity. And for those who lived through it, there is something uniquely powerful in knowing you were there, you witnessed it, you endured it, and in many ways you helped shape the America that exists today. History books may summarize the 1960s in a few chapters, but for those who lived it, it was a lifetime of moments, ordinary and extraordinary, woven together. And perhaps that's the final truth of the decade. It wasn't just about change, it was about growth. And growth, even when uncomfortable, leaves a legacy worth remembering.